I first walked up to Abbey Mills pumping station on Abbey Lane in East London, assuming it would be exactly what the guidebooks call it, a Victorian cathedral of sewage built between 1865 and 1868 to lift waste into Joseph Bazalgette's new main drainage system. The official record is neat, a cruciform plan, 8 beam engines, and an ornate Byzantine Ruskinian shell around a purely functional industrial heart. That afternoon I had an 1868 engraving and a later engineering drawing laid out beside a recent renovation report. The documents agreed on one thing: this was just a pumping station. Yet when I measured the dome geometry from high-resolution photographs and compared it to the ground plan, I found radial precision more typical of monumental religious architecture than of mid-19th century utility buildings. Some researchers would call that a Tartarian signature. I am less certain, but the building keeps pointing somewhere else. I arrive at Abbey Mills on an overcast afternoon, walking the greenway above Bazalgette's buried sewers. From the raised path, the pumping station sits in Mill Meads like a misplaced palace. Yellow brick, red arches, traces of demolished towers, and a central dome that looks more Byzantine than sewerage. The scale is immediately wrong. This is not how the Victorians built utility infrastructure elsewhere. This is something dressed as utility infrastructure. The official plaque dates the complex to the late 1860s and credits Bazalgette, Edmund Cooper, and architect Charles Driver. It says nothing about lower windows half submerged in soil, nor about the curious way one elevation meets the ground as if the building had sunk or the street had risen. That buried window pattern is exactly what Tartaria researchers obsess over. First-floor windows now serve as basements, identical in size and ornament to the floors above, their lower arches bricked in or cut off by pavement. Inside, archival photos show a cruciform engine hall supporting 8 beam engines, 2 in each arm. The scale is unnecessary for a simple lift station. The cast iron ornament reads more like a cathedral nave than a pump house. Victorian historians explain this as industrial historicism and a taste for over-designed utility buildings. I accept that explanation briefly. Then I compare the basement ventilation grills in an 1870s photograph with modern ground level. The earlier image shows a full lower arcade fully open to air. Today only the upper half of those arches remains visible. If nothing catastrophic happened, where did that height go? The building is exactly where the records say it is, but parts of it are now below a ground line that arrived later. If this were the only example, I would call it subsidence. It is not. Back at my desk, I spread out the standard narrative. In the wake of mid-19th century cholera and the Great Stink of 1858, Bazalgette builds London's intercepting sewers, including ornate pumping stations like Crossness and Abbey Mills. Engineering journals from that period praise the new system's capacity and the skill of the ironwork, and architectural critics mock the Cathedral of Sewage as gratuitously decorative. The story is tidy, industrial crisis, heroic engineer, exuberant Victorian aesthetics. Nothing about Tartaria, no hidden empire, no mud flood. I overlay an 1868 plan of Abbey Mills with a current satellite image. The cruciform layout is almost perfectly symmetrical along both axes, down to matching stair turrets and window spacing. That symmetry is not unusual by itself, but the dome's radius and the spacing of the arms align closely to ratios repeated in disparate grand 19th century buildings, including exhibition halls, certain railway terminals, and a handful of government complexes often compiled in Tartarian architecture videos and research blogs. In official language, these are just Victorian eclectic designs borrowing Byzantine and Moorish motifs. In alternative circles, they are interpreted as nodes in a pre-existing Tartarian power grid. with domes described as energy collectors and cruciform layouts described as resonant shapes. I do not endorse that physics. The evidence does not support free energy claims. What I can verify is simpler. Different continents, different supposed architects, nearly identical geometric fingerprints. The geometry by itself proves nothing, but it tells me where to look next. Underground. On a return visit, I request access to renovation documentation and limited interior areas. Recent Thames water material notes that the original beam engines are gone and the historic shell now surrounds mostly empty space and some standby equipment. The machinery that once justified this cathedral has been removed. In a corridor off one cruciform arm, bricked-in archway sits half a meter below the current floor level, visible only because later plaster has flaked away. It is not marked on the public tour map. Older maintenance diagrams archived from the late 19th century show an access tunnel in roughly this location, leading toward now redundant culverts. Those culverts connected to low-level sewers at a depth greater than the present external ground. Officially, the sealed doorway represents rational decommissioning, systems updated and old passages closed for safety. In the language of Tartaria researchers, such sealed arches are classic indicators of repurposed infrastructure, especially when they align with buried windows and suggest an earlier ground or basement level. I photographed the bricked arch, aligning frame lines with structural joints. The brick infill does not quite match the surrounding masonry. Color, bond pattern, and mortar composition differ subtly, as though someone had filled an older, more refined opening with cheaper, later material. Historic England's listing notes multiple phases of alteration, but focuses on decorative losses rather than sub-floor modifications. One sealed doorway proves nothing. Yet paired with sunken windows and an official story that says nothing about major level changes, it behaves like the first loose thread on a tightly woven narrative. To see whether this is unique, I need a control group. Another cathedral of sewage built at the same time with the same engineer but on different ground. Across the Thames at Crossness pumping station, constructed in the same decade as Abbey Mills, the pattern repeats: extravagant ornament, functionally excessive symmetry, and an underground world far more elaborate than most tourists ever see. Engineering reports describe massive underground reservoirs and culverts necessary to raise effluent from low-lying southern districts by around 12 meters. The Victorian explanation is straightforward: gravity, gradients, and the solution to a sanitary crisis. From an architectural standpoint, however, the level of cast iron detailing and the regularity of the plan go far beyond mere utility. When I compare historic plans of Crossness with those of Abbey Mills, the proportions are uncannily similar: cruciform or cross-shaped volumes, centrally organized machinery, and peripheral spaces whose purpose is not fully explained in public summaries. The underground chambers at Crossness are vast, barrel-vaulted, and finished with the same attention to symmetry as the visible structure above. A maintenance report from 1891 mentions sealing of lower chambers containing machinery of uncertain origin. I found this notation buried in a Thames water archive, unremarked upon in any public history. Alternative Tartaria literature often groups such pumping stations with star forts and grand civic buildings as part of a hidden, hydraulically powered infrastructure network. In that reading, these sites are not eccentric Victorians decorating sewers. They are reskinned nodes of an older water management system, partially buried by a 19th century mud flood and repurposed. The historical record firmly attributes design and execution to named Victorian engineers and architects, supported by dated contracts and parliamentary funding. The question, therefore, is not whether Bazalgette existed, but whether he and his contemporaries always built from scratch. The more I study the plans, the more they feel like renovations, especially when I start finding earlier layers beneath them. I trace Abbey Mills and Crossness back through land use history. Abbey Mills stands on the site of an older watermill associated with Stratford-Langthorne Abbey, recorded as Wiggamolne in the early 14th century. Crossness rises from former marshland, reclaimed for river embankment and sewage works. In both locations, 19th century engineering overlays earlier patterns of water management, mills, ditches, tidal flows. That is expected. What is less expected is the precision of the Victorian response. The sewers and pumping stations are positioned with near survey grade alignment along long east-west axes, mirroring older river bends yet maintaining internal symmetry that has more in common with idealized geometric fortifications and starfort designs than with ad hoc industrial schemes. While official documentation explains this as good surveying and rational planning, Tartaria researchers point to similar alignments in starfort cities and impossible red brick complexes worldwide. For them, the Victorian layer represents adaptation of inherited, possibly Tartarian groundwork rather than original invention. I am cautious about that leap. Yet when renovation files note unexpected existing foundations, thick masonry pads, discovered below anticipated depth, or vaulted substructures not shown on early sewer plans, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Those notes are usually brief, buried in technical appendices. Existing brickwork encountered, adapted to support new culvert. Their presence suggests that the Victorians themselves sometimes built on older, unknown fabric. In a survey document from 1872, an engineer notes that certain foundation walls predate our works by unknown duration and recommends incorporating them rather than removing them. The notation is matter of fact. The implication is extraordinary. Older fabric implies older design choices. To see the full pattern, I look away from London to the maps that coined the very word Tartaria. In the reading room of a map library, I turn pages of 17th and 18th century atlases where vast stretches of Eurasia are labelled simply Tartaria or Great Tartary. On a Jodocus Hondius engraving, the cartouche for Tartaria fills an entire quadrant. Cities, rivers, and mountain chains are sketched with more confidence than detail. Modern historians explain this label as a shorthand European geographers used for poorly understood territories in Central and Northern Asia. Contemporary fact checks emphasize that Tartary was never a single political entity, let alone an erased global empire. Yet the same maps that casually label half a continent Tartaria also show, in miniature, highly regular fortifications and grid-planned cities at key junctions. Later in the 19th century, those cartouches disappear. The same landmass is subdivided into Russian Empire, Chinese Empire, Turkestan, Mongolia. The word Tartaria retreats into the margins, then vanishes entirely from official cartography. Alternative researchers take this cartographic erasure and pair it with the sudden appearance of highly sophisticated industrial-era architecture across Europe, North America, and Asia. Domes, starforts, vast exposition complexes. For them, the maps are evidence of a lost Tartarian civilization whose infrastructure was later rebranded. I cannot confirm that. But what I can say is this: while the name fades from maps, the architectural signatures associated with Tartarian research become more frequent in the very cities those maps now emphasize, including London, which builds its most ornate waterworks and civic infrastructure precisely as the word Tartary is being retired. Names vanish from paper, patterns remain in brick, stone, and iron. The next step is to follow one pattern type: hydraulic systems. Victorian water industry studies describe an extraordinary network of reservoirs, pumping stations, and underground mains across Britain. Many of these buildings share a similar visual language: monumental facades, domes or towers, and unexpectedly lavish interiors for what are essentially industrial sites. At Abbey Mills, Crossness and other stations, the surviving documentation outlines deep shafts, balancing chambers and brick-lined tunnels designed to equalize pressure and manage surges. Historic photos show maintenance staff standing in vast, barrel-vaulted spaces that today are sealed, flooded, or repurposed. The scale of these underground works exceeds what contemporary sanitary engineering would seem to require. Tartaria theorists often highlight these chambers as relics of a more advanced hydraulic system. Cisterns, pressure domes, and buried conduits, they argue, exceed mid-19th century capabilities or needs. Mainstream historians rebut this by pointing to the urgent sanitary crisis, industrial financing, and known construction methods of the era. Both explanations have merit. Neither fully accounts for the evidence. The contradiction appears in the details. An article on Victorian pumping stations notes that the architectural drama seems disproportionate to the apparently commonplace purpose, acknowledging a tension between utilitarian function and grand form. Building conservation texts explain buried basement windows as normal features of Georgian and Victorian lower ground accommodation, later compromised by rising street levels and damp. I stand in front of Abbey Mills again, counting arch courses and comparing them with those photographs. The thickness of the walls, the redundancy of some shafts, and the now sealed lower openings all suggest that water once moved differently here, or at least that the designers were planning for flows we no longer fully understand. To know whether this is simply Victorian over-engineering, I follow the pattern beyond Britain. Using digitized archives, I compare Abbey Mills' cruciform layout and dome-to-water works and civic buildings elsewhere, a cross-shaped pumping station in Philadelphia, a reservoir crowned with a dome in Mumbai, and railway termini in Buenos Aires and Melbourne associated with Victorian imperial expansion. Although each has its own architect and local context, several share a specific combination: a symmetrical plan, a centralized vertical volume, and subterranean chambers with complex hydraulic rolls. These recurring features suggest a common engineering logic. In Tartaria-focused media, these buildings are compiled as examples of a single global architectural DNA, allegedly inherited from an erased Tartarian infrastructure grid. In that reading, the domes are not decorative, but functional. The symmetry is not aesthetic preference, but engineering requirement, and the underground chambers are not Victorian innovation, but Tartarian inheritance. I remain wary of that conclusion. I cannot ignore that many of these structures appear in cities whose rapid 19th century development is often credited to the Industrial Revolution alone, yet whose earliest photographs sometimes show buildings apparently completed before official construction start dates, or streets where first floors now act as basements. These anomalies merit careful attention. An 1876 photograph of a Melbourne railway terminus shows the building fully operational, with mature landscaping and weathered stonework, yet official records date its construction from 1874 through 1879. The discrepancy is small, but troubling. Either the photograph is misdated, or the building aged faster than physics allows, or the official timeline is incomplete. Official histories explain much of this through known processes: raising street levels to combat flooding, building over earlier foundations, and reusing stone or brick. Alternative sources push the mud flood narrative, a sudden global burial event that partially submerged an older urban layer. Between those poles lies a narrow, uncomfortable path. The physical record shows repeated use of deeply buried infrastructure whose origin stories are not always fully documented, later integrated into industrial networks. That pattern is real even if its cause is disputed. Whether that earlier layer was simply pre-industrial or something more advanced is the question this investigation cannot yet answer. What it can do is show that the anomalies are not isolated, they form a pattern, and patterns invite closer scrutiny. Turning from pumping stations to fortifications, I examine bastion forts and star forts, especially those with documented systems and water systems at their core. The fortress of Mazagan in Morocco, constructed around an underground cistern essential for siege survival, provides an instructive example. In plan view, these forts reveal radial symmetry, interlocking angles, and carefully engineered ditches and embankments designed to channel not only attackers, but also water. Their geometry is older than the Victorian era, yet when you compare the proportional relationships between bastions and internal courtyards to the ratios used in 19th century domed waterworks, the echoes are difficult to dismiss. The same angular relationships appear. The same ratios govern the spacing of key elements. The same attention to water management underlies apparently different structures separated by centuries and continents. Mainstream scholarship frames star forts as responses to gunpowder artillery, combining defensive logic with geometric elegance. The angled bastions deflect cannon fire, and the symmetry allows overlapping fields of fire. The explanation is rational, documented, and widely accepted. Tartaria advocates, however, cast these structures as multi-purpose energy and water hubs, part of the same hypothesized Tartarian network that allegedly fed free energy domes and atmospheric devices. I am not persuaded by etheric power claims. The physics does not support them. When I map starfort locations, Victorian waterworks, and later cathedral-like infrastructure buildings onto older Tartaria labeled maps, I see clusters in areas once broadly designated as Tartary and in imperial capitals that later dominated those regions. The correlation is imperfect but persistent. At minimum, there is a shared language of geometry and water management crossing centuries and political regimes. Whether this continuity implies a persistent, perhaps Tartarian, engineering tradition, or simply repeated rediscovery of efficient forms remains open. The star forts suggest that someone, somewhere, understood principles of hydraulic engineering and geometric design that later builders inherited, adapted, or rediscovered. To push further, I look not at intact systems, but at their absences, the pieces deliberately removed. Back in London, I revisit the record of Abbey Mills and Crossness. Historic descriptions emphasize 8 beam engines in a cruciform array at Abbey Mills and immense beam engines at Crossness, each capable of lifting millions of gallons daily. The Victorian achievement is celebrated in engineering journals, photographed for posterity, and praised as the solution to London's sanitary crisis. Today, none of that original machinery survives in situ. At Abbey Mills, the engines were scrapped in the 1930s. At Crossness, preservation efforts saved one engine, but the others are gone. In some cases, machinery has been relocated to museums. In others, it has simply vanished into scrap metal and memory. Compact modern pumps now operate in new buildings nearby, handling the same flows with a fraction of the footprint. Renovation reports from the late 20th century read like quiet obituaries. Original engines were removed and substructure was retained. Floor levels are altered, access shafts capped, and underground spaces partially infilled with concrete. From an operational standpoint, this is practical modernization. From an investigative perspective, it complicates attempts to understand how the original systems used space, pressure, and flow. Alternative Tartaria writers point to such removal as evidence of deliberate erasure, the alleged Tartarian heart extracted and left only as a decorated shell. Mainstream explanations, once again, are grounded in economics and safety. Machinery wears out, industrial sites are updated, preservation is expensive and selective. Both explanations have merit. Absence itself, however, is a kind of fact. Where heavy engines once sat, loading foundations and aligning with buried conduits, we now see empty platforms and capped openings. A Thames Water report from 1987 notes that original engine beds show evidence of modification predating Victorian installation, but it offers no further detail. Without the machines, it is harder to tell whether the Victorians designed every aspect or whether they adapted existing voids and channels optimized for some prior hydraulic logic. Without the engines, only the shells speak. So I turn to the shells that most clearly echo Tartarian motifs, domes. Across different continents, 19th century domed buildings share certain proportional and layout traits. Central domes flanked by smaller cupolas, long axial corridors connecting key volumes, and facades dense with repeating arches. When overlaid on city grids, these structures often sit at the intersections of major thoroughfares or along linear alignments that alternative researchers describe as power corridors. These repetitions speak to a recurring geometry. At Abbey Mills, the central dome rises above a crossing of sewer lines whose alignments match long, straight embankments carrying the northern outfall sewer toward Beckton. In purely Victorian terms, this is efficient routing. Keep gradients shallow, follow rational paths, minimize excavation. In Tartarian reinterpretation, the dome marks a node where earlier energy or water flows converged, and the Victorians simply built atop what already existed. I test a modest version of that hypothesis by mapping sewer lines, pumping stations, and known older watercourses across East London. The resulting network has its own logic, but when I overlay historic river meanders and pre-embankment shorelines, I see that some Victorian alignments mirror older natural flows while straightening them. The domes sit near points of curvature or confluence, as if marking transitions in an older system. This can be explained without invoking Tartaria. Engineers often follow existing geography. Water flows downhill, and infrastructure follows water. However, when you combine these alignments with buried windows, sealed sublevels, and globally repeated dome ratios, the result begins to resemble what Tartaria researchers claim: an inherited infrastructure skeleton dressed in local styles and attributed to local builders. I examine an 1869 engineering diagram that shows the Abbey Mills dome in cross-section. The proportions are elegant, the geometry precise. A notation in the margin reads, "Dome curvature per existing foundation alignment." The phrase is ambiguous. It could mean the dome was designed to match a foundation the Victorians themselves laid, or it could mean the dome was designed to match a foundation that was already there. I still cannot state that a Tartarian civilization built these sites. I can, however, state that the Victorian narrative rarely acknowledges how much it leans on, reuses, or quietly erases pre-existing layers. And where there are pre-existing layers, there is always the possibility that some of what we think we built, we only unearthed. To address the most controversial element head-on, I examine the so-called mud flood theory. The claim is that in the mid to late 19th century, a global cataclysm buried cities in meters of liquefied earth, hiding an older civilization often labeled Tartarian. Mainstream geology and history do not support a single global event of that kind. There is no geological signature, no consistent sediment layer, no documentary evidence of worldwide catastrophe. The theory, as commonly presented, does not survive scientific scrutiny. Yet, localized floods, landslides, and urban reconstructions are well documented. Chicago was literally razed by jacking up buildings and infilling beneath them in the 1860s. Parts of Seattle sit atop older streets, accessible today as underground tours. Victorian engineering articles and conservation texts show how changing damp-proofing standards and rising pavements turned many ground floors into half-sunken basements with buried windows These are real phenomena, documented in city archives and building records. Tartaria media stitches them together into a single, global narrative, pairing them with erased Tartary labels on maps and ornate industrial architecture to argue for a deliberate civilizational reset. Critical analyses emphasize that the Tartarian Empire concept is pseudo-historical, repurposing older geographic terminology and misinterpreted photographs. In my own work, I find a third position. There is no need to posit a secret global flood to explain every buried window or sealed chamber. Urban development suffices. Street levels rise over decades through accumulated paving, debris, and deliberate grading. Basements become sub-basements. Ground floors become cellars. The process is gradual, documented, and unremarkable. But there is a recurring pattern of older infrastructural fabric being overwritten by newer narratives, with only partial documentation of what was removed or reinterpreted. In that sense, mudflood becomes a metaphor, not necessarily for liquefied earth, but for layers of assumption and neglect that bury prior engineering achievements, whether pre-Victorian or, as some insist, Tartarian. The renovation files I have examined rarely explain what they seal. The engineering notes I have found rarely describe what they adapt. The photographs I have compared rarely acknowledge what preceded them. The absence of documentation is itself a kind of burial. An 1883 maintenance log for Abbey Mills notes that lower chambers were filled per instruction without specifying whose instruction or why. A similar note from Crossness mentions redundant hydraulic apparatus removed and disposed with no inventory of what that apparatus comprised. These silences accumulate. They do not prove Tartaria, but they create space for questions that official histories decline to answer. Which leaves one final question, not about events, but about inheritance. How much did the 19th century truly invent, and how much did it quietly inherit? I return one last time to Abbey Mills. From the Greenway, the pumping station still looks like a misplaced temple, cruciform plan, restored brickwork, and a dome rising above the low landscape of Stratford marshes. The original beam engines are gone. Modern pumps work quietly in a separate building erected in the 1990s. The Cathedral of Sewage has become a heritage site visited by architecture students and urban explorers, photographed for coffee table books celebrating Victorian engineering genius. The facts are firm. This site was constructed in the 1860s as part of London's first great sewer network. Its designers and builders are named Basil Jett, Cooper, Driver. Their drawings survive in archives. Their intentions are recorded in parliamentary testimony and engineering journals. The city they served had genuine sanitary crises, and Victorian engineering rose to meet them with unprecedented ambition. Yet other facts remain just as stubborn. The building incorporates sealed openings whose original use is no longer clear. Its lower windows sit closer to buried levels than to open air, despite no documented subsidence event. Its geometry aligns with broader patterns seen in pumping stations, reservoirs, and starfort-like structures worldwide, patterns that alternative researchers group under the banner of Tartaria, and that mainstream histories seldom discuss together. I pull out the 1868 engraving I brought on my first visit and hold it beside a photograph I took this afternoon. The dome is the same, the arches are the same. But in the engraving, the lower arcade is fully visible, open to air and light. In my photograph, that arcade is half buried, its arches truncated by a ground level that arrived later, through processes no one has fully explained. What I can say as an investigator rather than a theorist is this: 19th century infrastructure did not rise from a vacuum. It often stands on foundations, literal and conceptual, whose full lineage we have not carefully traced. Some of those foundations may be mundane older works, mills and ditches and embankments from centuries past. Some may represent engineering knowledge that we have undercredited or misattributed, and some may connect to patterns that Tartaria researchers have been pointing to for years, patterns too consistent and too global to dismiss as coincidence, yet too fragmentary to prove as inheritance. The phrase Tartarian flood may never describe a real geological event, but the idea of a civilization whose works we repurpose without understanding is uncomfortably plausible. The sealed chambers beneath our cities, the buried arcades along our streets, the machinery removed before anyone catalogued its function. These are not evidence of Tartaria, but they are evidence of something we have chosen not to examine too closely. I end, not with a conclusion, but with an image. An archival photograph of Abbey Mills engine hall, its iron columns gleaming, beam engines aligned under the dome, workers standing dwarfed by machinery whose purpose and power we can only partially reconstruct, and today's echo of that view, the same space emptied, the same dome overhead, the same sealed arch at the far wall, leading to chambers whose contents were removed before anyone thought to ask what they contained. Between those two frames lies everything we think we know about who built our world and everything we may still be missing. The sealed doorway remains closed. The photograph never explained what had been removed. And across continents, identical signatures appear in structures built decades apart, in an age when such coordination should have been impossible. Tartaria may be a word retired from maps, but whatever it once named has left its fingerprints in brick and silence. The investigation does not end. It only pauses, waiting for the next sealed chamber to be opened, the next archive to be digitized, the next photograph to surface showing a building that should not exist in the year it was taken. The questions I carried to Abbey Mills remain unanswered, but they have multiplied. Each sealed doorway suggests another. Each buried window implies a flaw we have forgotten. Each identical dome, separated by oceans and decades, whispers of coordination we cannot explain. The dome at Abbey Mills still rises above the marshes. The red lamp still burns in the archives. And somewhere beneath the streets we walk, older systems wait in darkness, sealed but not destroyed, forgotten but not gone.